Luke, Robert, I have to start with you. And it feels like this whole topic of pardons was very well deployed by the committee, but in some ways saving some of this evidence for the very end, that not only did he know he lost, he knew that he and his aides had likely committed crimes.
Right. Well, as the January 6th committee is releasing these hundreds of transcripts, and they're racing to get them all out the door before January 3rd, when Republicans will take control of the Congress. The reason they're doing that is they really want the full transcripts out there, and they don't want the new House majority to be able to cherry pick evidence and selectively release things. But as they're putting this out, we're seeing even more revelations that we didn't know necessarily in real time about. We've heard a lot about talk about the pardons, but to be sort of a fly on the wall here and hear the discussion between Donald Trump and Pat Cipollone as he sort of floating ideas. Well, what if we pardon everybody? What if we pardon only the people who went in the building? What if we pardon all of White House staff? The idea that Donald Trump believed all these pardons were necessary, I think, is quite telling. And in the January 6th committee's report, when they point to the pardons that were requested by some members of Congress, they say that they believe that that is clear evidence of a guilty conscience, that looking back, some of these people after January 6th looked at the events they were involved in and thought that they would have criminal liability here and criminal exposure. And so, that's the subtext to these documents that were released yesterday. But yes, it's quite opening conversations here that the president is floating to his top lawyer in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara McQuade, a pardon is not a pack of White House M&Ms or higher up the valuable items to lift from the White House, a blanket from Air Force One. A pardon isn't like a party favor. And the fact that he handed them out so frequently has almost desensitized everybody that talks about pardons and covers pardons a little bit. But the fact that he wanted to issue blanket pardons to the entire White House staff and the rioters themselves, let me read some of what the rioters did. One rioter, Robert Palmer, was convicted for assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers with a dangerous weapon, sentenced to 63 months. What he did on that day, what Trump wanted to issue blanket pardons that would have included Robert Palmer, he threw a wooden plank at the police. He sprayed fire extinguisher fluid at officers, then threw the canister at them after it was empty. Then he assaulted another police officer with a metal pole, throwing it at them like a spear. Devlin Thompson would have been pardoned in this blanket pardon. Here's what he did. He threw objects and projectiles at police officers, including flagpoles. He grabbed and stole the officers' riot shields, helped throw a large speaker at the front line of officers, picked up a metal baton and swung it overhead and downward against the police line. I mean, you can go on and on at the things that these people who Donald Trump thought were worthy of a blanket pardon did to the Capitol Police. What do you make of this, Barbara McQuade?
Well, the way Donald Trump used the pardon power throughout his presidency was a violation of the rule of law. The idea of a blanket pardon is a violation of the rule of law. He bypassed the Justice Department consistently and its Office of the Pardon Attorney, which looks at cases and tries to promote uniformity in issuing pardons. And at the end of the day, a pardon is a sign of mercy, of forgiveness. The people that Donald Trump wanted to forgive are the people you just described, who defaced our Capitol and caused serious harm to Capitol Police and endangered the lives of lawmakers in Congress. I think that Luke makes the very good point that this is evidence of what prosecutors refer to as consciousness of guilt. That is, the only reason you need a pardon is if you believe you did something wrong. And it can matter a lot in the kinds of charges that the committee has recommended to DOJ. Two of those do require that sort of cognizance. Conspiracy to defraud the United States requires knowledge of fraud. Obstruction of an official proceeding requires a corrupt intent. And so to demonstrate those intents, one of the things prosecutors can use in evidence is consciousness of guilt, as evidenced by this desire to have blanket pardons.
You know, Pete, on the way out the door, Trump pardoned a lot of the architects of the coup. He pardoned what's his name, Bannon. He pardoned Flynn, who makes his way into the West Wing in all of the days leading up to the insurrection. He pardons Manafort. I mean, you know, they were not hard to get. But so it's always interesting when someone pushes back, and it's almost like, how bad was it? It was so bad that someone said no to blanket pardons for the entire White House staff and the entire lot of insurrectionists at the U.S. Capitol. What does that say about the importance of Pat Cipollone as a witness to DOJ?
Well, Nicole, I think it's extraordinarily important that you had people like Pat Cipollone, that you had people who, regardless of the chaos, were still willing to stand up in the last days of the administration and say, you can't do this. And if they couldn't persuade him to sort of try and explain to him the political liability, the legal liability that he might face if he did these things. Now, it's astounding. And, you know, on the one hand, you did a great job on the run-up showing, on the one hand, his public statements that he was making about the protesters, and then contrasting that with the things in these private conversations where he wanted to pardon all the folks. And the question of, well, what does he want to do? Well, we know what he wants to do, because the fact is that right now, as a declared candidate for president in 2024, he is making statements and throwing out the idea that if elected as a president in the future, he will still go ahead and pardon all these people. So when you look at all the behavior that we've seen, all these multi-year sentences that are being handed out, we know full well what Trump wants to do, because like he always does, he's telling us in plain language exactly what he intends to do if he regains the White House.
Yeah, I mean, Katty Kay, there's so many elements of what the committee has unearthed that are ongoing. The other one is the very bad behavior of one Mark Meadows. Let me read from Luke's reporting on this batch of transcripts that came out late last night. Cassidy Hutchinson also said Mr. Meadows had sought broad pardons. Meadows was personally concerned that there would be a connotation of violence associated with everybody who had gone to the Capitol that day. So he thought it was an idea worth entertaining and raising to White House counsel's office to pardon those who had been inside the Capitol, she said. She added there was a period where several White House staffers and administration officials wanted to pardon themselves prior to leaving, and he was one of them. What do we make of this pile of evidence the committee had and really did, again, save till the end, about Mark Meadows, who Adam Kinzinger describes as their star witness for all of the texts that he turned over, even though he would end up not cooperating fully?
Yeah, I mean, he's central to those. I mean, I think you described it brilliantly, the kind of chaos of the last few days. And we have to keep reminding ourselves the chaos of that December and January in the White House. And at the center of it all, in a way, is Mark Meadows. I mean, burning documents. I can't believe Barbara would ever think it was very good when you have somebody who is potentially a star witness burning what are potentially White House secret documents. I mean, we don't know whether these were the originals or whether these were just copies. But either way, a dozen times throwing papers, White House papers in the fireplace just doesn't look very good. And there he is pushing for some kind of a blanket pardon. And I think it's worth remembering Cassidy Hutchinson's other testimony, her earlier testimony, in which I think it was Pat Cipollone she heard saying, listen, we must make sure the president doesn't go down to the Capitol on January the 6th because we could get charged with all sorts of criminal acts if he's just down there. He was very conscious of the fact that there was potential criminality around what was happening even before it happened on January the 6th. And so the idea, and that comes across in these latest transcripts too, and Donald Trump may say, look, you know, or Mark Meadows may say, look, we just want to make sure that they don't try and throw everything at us, they being the Democrats, because they have some kind of vindictive vengeance, you know, against us, as in other impeachment trials against Donald Trump. He always had this sense that he was the victim of the Democrats. But actually, there were certainly people who were well aware and who were saying it publicly in that White House that there was criminality associated with what was happening in January the 6th and what was being planned on January the 6th. So that defense just doesn't wash. And Mark Meadows is smart enough to have known exactly what Pat Cipollone was thinking from a legal perspective and what a plea for a request for some kind of a pardon would look like.
Yeah, I mean, look, Barbara, I want to pull you in on this. I mean, to Katty's point, a pardon doesn't do anything for the Democrats that you think are after you. I mean, that was the stated purpose, but a pardon doesn't help you with a congressional probe. It helps you in a criminal prosecution. The other thing that Caddy said is that, if there were copies, in the White House, every copy of every draft of every piece of paper belongs to the federal government. Every speech that you are given, that you make edits on, that contributes to the final product is the property of the National Archives. None of it belongs to you. And I want to read from Vanity Fair's reporting of Meadows burning documents. And this is about Cassidy Hutchinson, again, from her transcript. The former aide insinuated that Meadows tried to keep meetings off official records. She said there were certain things that had potentially been left off the Oval Office diary, although she said she didn't know the specific documents. She did, however, remember one specific name, Representative Scott Perry. She said that she recalled at least 2 burnings following Meadows' meetings with Perry. I mean, again, when the conduct of the most senior aides inside the White House, I believe most White House chiefs of staff have a cabinet rank, is from like a C mob movie. It really, really, I think, piques the attention and makes me want to know, Barbara McQuade, if you think DOJ already has this information or if they're learning it like we are from these transcripts.
Hard to know what they already have and don't have, but I agree with you, Nicole. This is some really interesting evidence. On the one hand, anybody who's ever worked in a government office knows that if you have documents that you need to dispose of, there are burn bags, there are shredders. The idea that you're burning it in your own fireplace is really unusual, and for that reason, highly suspect. I also think it's very interesting that Cassidy Hutchinson testified that on at least 2 occasions, she saw Mark Meadows burning documents after meeting with Scott Perry. Because remember, there is evidence that Scott Perry was the one who introduced Ken Klukowski, John Eastman, Jeff Clark, and brought that whole plot together, what Pat Cipollone later referred to as the murder-suicide plot. So that is incredibly interesting. I think it really raises the stakes to try to get cooperation out of Mark Meadows. He has potential criminal exposure himself, and so getting his testimony could be incredibly important. We know that the Justice Department has already gotten Pat Cipollone's testimony, likely more forthcoming than he was to the committee, so they could have that information as well.